Good stuff. Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, good evening, as per usual. Thanks very much indeed for coming along to this webinar, which is about the second round of our benchmarking process. How do wine sustainability standards stack up? As you all know, we did an initial pilot round at the end of last year, and we've now done a further set of benchmarking. And what we're going to share with you today are some of the sort of key themes that have emerged through this research process. Um, let's just quickly recap why we're doing this. I know this is sort of slightly like the sort of health and safety lecture before you actually go into a factory, but it's important stuff I think to run through. Um, the the reason for this piece of work is that you've got anything up to 40 plus sustainability standards in wine around the world, which on the one hand makes sense from the perspective that they all are able to talk to quite specific geographies. The challenge is, how do you read across them? How do you understand what the similarities are and the differences are between them? Obviously, that historically raised the question as to why we as an organization didn't put together a single global wine sustainability standard. And really, the reason for that is quite simple. What makes wine is the terroir. It's where it comes from. It's the environment and the atmosphere in which it's created. And the same is also true of sustainability standards. But therefore, there's still a need to provide that read across between the standards, hence this benchmarking process. So say we did a number in our first pilot at the end of last year, and we've done another 8 on this occasion, and really massive thanks to the standards bodies themselves. We couldn't do it nearly as well as we do without the really strong collaboration of the standards bodies we're working with. Realize that sometimes it's a bit like walking into someone's house and making observations about the soft furnishings and the wall colors. So we'd like to thank the standards bodies for being so open and so prepared to talk, because for reasons I'll talk about later, I think it really, really is helpful in the other part of our mission, which is in this process, which is not just about avoiding greenwashing, clarity around what standards mean, but it's also about how do we improve the whole process of sustainability in wine over time. Now, it's important, I think, to recap how the benchmarking process works. I mean, even we sometimes forget about it, but I think it's important that we just quickly take a look at how the actual process of benchmarking proceeds, where it came from, all the different elements of it. Um, Part of the reason for this is that obviously a key aspect of our benchmarking process is to look at the quality of governance and audit of the standards bodies that we're working with. That no matter how good a standard is, if the audit is not strong enough, if the governance of the standard is not strong enough, then there's a weakness. And so if we're asking those things of the standards bodies, we need to be able to demonstrate that we do that ourselves. So to recap how we got to where we got to with the standards benchmarking, at the heart of all we do is the global reference framework, which I'll talk about a bit more in a moment. But that was developed over the space of about 18 months in 3 phases, as you can see from the slide, starting with a review of existing wine sustainability standards to pick out some key themes, but looking also at what there is from other sectors, and then pulling that together. And at each stage, that work was presented to meetings like this. So it had oversight of all of our members. Secondly, last year we developed a scoring matrix. How did we actually bash the GRF against individual standards? How do we score against that? Then at the end of last year, we did a pilot study to really test out that system, test out that process. The way we were going to do it, did it work? Broadly, it did. Few nuances, the most obvious being a need for a sort of longer conversation with some standards bodies to make sure that what we were saying was something that was properly reflecting what they thought they were doing. Obviously, we're now at that second round of evaluations, which we're reporting on today. A bit more on the global reference framework. We're the Sustainable Wine Roundtable, so it sort of behoved us really to be able to define, well, what exactly do we mean by sustainability in wine? And it's also worth commenting on the language around sustainability, because there's no such thing as sustainable at the moment. It's always going to be an ever moving target. So the term we use, which I agree is not terribly punchy, but it's the what we want to see is a credible journey towards sustainability. So the global reference framework built on existing good practice in wine. So that was the existing, looking at what existing wine sustainability standards were doing. but also looking at other wine bodies like FIVs and OIV, but also then looked outside the wine sector. I mean, Toby, James, and I have all worked extensively in sustainability in other sectors, and that means that we can draw some of the lessons that other analytic sectors have learned. So we draw on things like the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative, Consumer Goods Forward, and so on, Forum, and so on. So drew all that together and then really said, here are the issues that we need sustainability standards to cover, and that's that list there. And obviously, more is known about some of those factors than others. So there's an awful lot known, for example, about environmental performance in the vineyard, but less around packaging and less around logistics, which we hope we'll be going to deal with in the future. And those of you who have seen our sort of credentials deck will know that one of the little wheels we've got is the GRF is both sort of heart of this is what we understand by sustainability, but it also, by dint of the gaps in it, informs the action areas that we're working in. So packaging, logistics being two obvious areas. But also because by definition, that process of understanding what sustainability is will evolve over time, that global reference framework will be updated annually to make sure each year reflects what we know to be best practice in sustainability at that moment. The scoring matrix was designed to translate looking at an individual standard to scoring against the matrix. I'm not going to go through all the detail, but it's basically everything from zero. Scoring zero means that the topic is not mentioned, and advanced three is basically everything is covered to an exemplary level. So that means that by and large, we don't give that many threes because that means that on any issue, it's absolutely all covered as well as it pretty much can be. I think the other thing that's important to say is that there's two aspects to what we do. Again, those of you members who've seen the first benchmark will know that there's quantitative scores. So literally, how does an individual standard score against each of the things in the matrix? But also, we have done a narrative evaluation, a narrative of this is what we think we're seeing in a standard. And that really allows us to get into the nitty gritty of how standards think they're trying to affect change, which, as I'll say a bit more about later, is really important in terms of, how does one really make sure that knowledge is shared and that what best practice looks like and how you make change happen is better understood. We also made sure it adhered to the ISIL benchmarking processes, which is something that a lot of sustainability standard processes look at. But again, as I said before, it's built for continued improvement. What we will be able to know at the end of this year is greater than what we knew at the end of last year, so it will be updated over time. There was also, again, considerable oversight of this whole process, both in terms of developing the reference framework and the scoring matrix. As I said before, at each stage it was presented to member meetings. So therefore we were able to get commentary from that. But there's also a small advisory group, and the names are there, which we were able to, on a day-to-day basis, bounce these ideas against to make sure that what we had was robust and reflected best practice. The pilot allowed us to tweak that to some degree. So that's where we are with that. So that is very much a sort of health and safety advisory, but I think it's important that we demonstrate in how we go about doing things that we are trying to be as robust as we are expecting standards bodies to be in what they do. Delaney, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. So before we actually really dive into the findings, I mean, just in line with what Peter mentioned, want to briefly walk through how the process actually looks in practice. So it's carried out by Peter and myself. And for each standard, we really follow a consistent and structured approach to make sure the evaluations are really thorough and as balanced as possible. So we start by collecting the most recent version of each standard with all of the supporting documentation and reference materials directly from the standards body, but we'll also use this time to get acquainted with the standard itself. So look through the website, speak to the team, that sort of thing. Then Peter and I independently review the documentation and we score the standard using our global reference framework and the scoring matrix. We also make notes throughout this process of any particularly relevant observations, whether that's a gap, a strength, or any implementation details that really stand out. And then after completing that independent review, we compare our scores and discuss any differences. Generally, we find that our assessments are really well aligned, but these discussions really help us challenge any assumptions that we're making and ensure that we're being consistent across all of our evaluations. Then we prepare a summary analysis, which just flags, any of the information that came out of that comparative exercise, highlights any areas where the standard might not fully align with the GRF. And this is the basis of the follow-up dialogue with the standards bodies that we carry out next. That dialogue is really, to me, the most important part of the process. And in many cases, the standards bodies are able to provide clarifications and additional documents that shift our understanding, which is really helpful. In others, they acknowledge areas where, that we've flagged for improvement and maybe come up with a plan on how they've tried to address it or how they will approach it in the future. Of course, there are some areas where we don't entirely agree. That's natural. But even those conversations really add a lot of value to our understanding. And ultimately, it allows us to gain a lot of a deeper insight on how the standard operates on a day-to-day basis, rather than just looking at the documents themselves. And then finally, we compile a evaluation, and that is what forms the basis of the members-only report. So then shifting forward, that gives a sense again of how we approached it, but the most important part is what we found. So across the 15 standards we've evaluated so far, a number of pretty clear themes have emerged and that touch on some structural issues, some recurring challenges, and some of the trade-offs that sustainability systems and standards often have to navigate. So we'll walk through some of the most important ones today, but we'll start with externally sourced grapes. So it's very common practice in the wine industry for producers to vinify grapes that they haven't grown themselves. And that's for a number of reasons, but whatever that might be, it's completely normal. It does raise some questions when it comes to certification. Right now, our global reference framework doesn't offer any specific guidance on what this means for the credibility of a sustainability label. And that's a real gap and something that we will be addressing during the next update of the GRF after we complete this round. Because the core question of what we're trying to do with this benchmarking process is, does the certification label on the bottle genuinely indicate that the wine inside was produced sustainably? So if some of the grapes that were in that bottle weren't grown under certified conditions, we have to ask, what proportion is enough to justify that label, or what additional oversight needs to be there to make sure that says it's fully sustainable. So some have really clear policies on this. There's often a percentage of brought-in grapes that are required to be certified, but there's different degrees of this. Some are a little bit more vague. Others go through, actual DOC registration logs to track the full chain of supply to make sure there's full oversight. So there's varying degrees with this, but regardless, it's a really important issue we will be including in the next revision of the global reference framework. Another recurring theme is, how do you make sustainability certification more accessible for smaller producers? And the barriers are pretty self-evident. Certification can be really expensive, especially if you factor in audit fees, membership costs, if it's an organization, and the administrative time it actually takes to go about pursuing certification. On top of that, many wineries smaller wineries don't necessarily have the internal capacity to manage the paperwork or do all the reporting requirements and that aspect of it. But these businesses are really important, and they represent a significant share of the global wine sector. And if we're serious about scale and impact, we have to make sure that smaller producers are being included in the process. So what's really encouraging to see is that a lot of the standards bodies we've looked at, almost all of them have been thinking about, how do we include smaller wineries and smaller businesses in certification? And those approaches take a couple different faces. So we just wanted to kind of cover off a few of those that we've seen so far. One of them is just managing fees. Many standards offer reduced cost or a simplified audit model to reduce the financial burden on smaller firms, but they also might have tiered requirements. So, for example, smaller producers might have to certify with fewer criteria than, say, a larger producer, which is meant to ease the burden of audit and reporting and certification, which in theory makes a lot of sense, but in practice, it can also be a little bit confusing when you have both smaller and larger producers using the same label, despite having met different thresholds for that actual criteria. Another approach is setting a lower bar across the board, which just, it sets a more basic level with the intention of raising expectations and requirements over time. which again, it can work, but it does risk also weakening the perceived credibility of the label in the short term. Um, Another one is providing a clear on ramp. So this approach really lays out a staged path for improvement. A lot of the standards have different levels of performance, whether that like level 1, 2, 3, 4, and having that provides a clear path from wherever you are in that stage to best practice and maturity, which gives almost a task list, a to-do list of what do I need to do to get there, which is helpful in terms of supporting when you don't necessarily have a big sustainability team. And just lastly, another interesting one we saw was we were calling it an umbrella approach. But one of the standards we looked at allows micro producers, think maybe 1 to 2 hectare size producers, which are often managed by a family or cooperative, to essentially be grandfathered in under the umbrella certification of a larger company. So, I mean, coming back to the initial point on externally sourced grapes, rather than exclude those grapes, the standard brings them into the audit, and it also, eases the actual cost of certification. So the final message is that there's really no one size fits all solution, and the design does matter. But in order to really work for small producers, we need to make sure it's practical, inclusive, and can be scalable. So for any sustainability certification to be really credible, it has to define what good performance looks like, and without that clarity, certification risks becoming diluted. But on the flip side, too much rigidity can really be a barrier, especially for resource limited companies or smaller companies that we were talking about earlier. And that flexibility within a robust process becomes really essential. And it was something that we noticed a lot with the standards we looked at this round. And it really comes to this theme of doability, or a pragmatic approach, which needs to recognize that not everything can be done at once and necessarily should be done at once. And instead, what really matters is that over time, what matters most is addressed first, but other improvements can be phased in over time. And a lot of standards have a set of, knockout criteria that must be met. They're non-negotiable. If you don't certify, or if you don't have those met, you can't be certified. But some others go beyond that and have a sort of a scale, a 1, 2, 3 scale. And so we have an example here of one of the standards we looked at this round that classifies nonconformities based off of this simple 1, 2, 3 level. Level 1 is the least severe, and it requires an action plan to address it if it's not resolved after the first year. It then becomes a level 2. So, initially we're saying this is not, an essential critical thing to get certification, but it's still important to be addressed. And if it's not addressed in that time bound, it needs to, escalate to a higher level. At which point, a corrective action is required. And then this is just to bring it into the practical example. A good example of this is staff training. So a lot of standards require that all employees have to receive mandatory training annually. But let's say someone is hired directly before the audit occurs. You might simply just not have the time to have the new staff member get fully trained up before the audit comes in. So a rigid system might penalize that, saying, okay, this staff member hasn't been fully trained. But a more pragmatic approach recognizes that constraint and ensures it moves on in a timely way. So there's flexibility at that end, but also the top end. So for wineries that are already really performing at a high level, what's next? Do you just add requirements for the sake of adding requirements? And a few of the standards, once that high level is reached, provide this menu of additional improvements or, additional practices that you can add that still encourages progress while also allowing producers to tailor their path based off of their local context and their needs or their operational realities. So with that, I'll pass back over to Peter to pick up on the next set of core themes.
Okay, thanks very much, Delaney. The next area that's become a sort of recurring theme is this whole piece around labour issues. Now, when we started the process, we knew that there was going to be more sensitivity around sort of labour issues than around, for example, viticulture, and that there was going to be some pushback in certain locations around, well, do we need to cover this? It's part of our national laws, part of our state laws. So why does it need to be within a standard? And we were quite robust at the beginning about saying, well, that's all very well, but the fact that it's in law does not necessarily mean that law is being properly enacted. Witness the situation a few months ago here in the UK where, despite the fact we've got very robust laws in place around modern slavery and human trafficking, there was slave labor found working in McDonald's restaurants east of London. So we were quite robust around the fact this needed to be in. But what we've found with all the conversations we've had is that the situation is actually a lot more nuanced and a lot more, let's just use say nuanced than perhaps we realized to begin with. Yes, they're less well covered. I mean, if you look at our scoring, generally speaking, the environmental components around vineyard and winery are broadly well dealt with, and generally scores on labour conditions are lower. Um, but there's generally a widespread agreement that yes, these issues do matter, and that even though there might be an initial response that, well, no, this is law, why do we need to include it? There is actually an increasing recognition that more needs to be done. But there's a real sense of these are sensitive issues, and if we push too hard too fast, then we risk losing people. Those quotes there are typical of several we've had that basically is this, well, you're almost impugning my integrity as a winemaker to even imply that I might possibly be using problematic labor practices. And so it's a question over time of how do you persuade people that yes, this is an issue they need to address, that they need to bring on board, and that there is more scrutiny going to be coming on these issues. I mean, one of the standards we covered this time round, the way they've handled it is absolutely fabulous because they've said, look, we know this is an issue that many of us where we will consider are covered properly by our laws. But there is international scrutiny. We need to make sure that these things are proactively looked at. And this standard has a very robust practice around proactively going and looking at practices of labour agencies. So there's a great deal of sensitivity here. But also there is still, I think, in many parts of the wine industry, a sense of this couldn't possibly be anything to do with us. How can it possibly be an issue that wine has to face into? And that is almost a charming naivety. I mean, I'm sometimes reminded in the conversations I've been having over the last year or two in wine of conversations that I might have had in, say, the apparel sector 20 years ago, when you talk to apparel producers who said, well, yes, there are labor rights problems in factories in Bangladesh and China, but that's not our problem. We just give them the orders. It's not something we need to manage. And over time, it became clear that yes, this was something that they did. So it's been really quite interesting to get that more nuanced understanding of how these issues sit, but also how the sensitivity is going to need to be there about how we push forward with these things over time. And I think that it does chime also with what we're seeing in some of our other working areas, and how we can fill that gap over time. I mean, the work that, we've been, working with DOCs in Italy, and we've been working also with WITA in South Africa to start to try and understand how these issues manifest. And I think beginning to bring that knowledge further forward, I think will ensure that this is an issue that gradually can be better handled within these standards. There's also actually a lot of cross learning, as in lateral learning between standards bodies, which we're in a position to be able to foster. So I think understanding the sensitivity of this piece and how to go about pushing it forward, I think again demonstrates the value of the sort of understanding it's not just about the quantitative score that a standard gets. It's how it's going about managing these things. The narrative evaluation is in terms of moving the thing forward, in our view, more important than the immediate score this in any given year. The other obvious gap is everything to do with packaging and the onward supply chain. Again, if we look at our scores across the ones we've done so far, generally speaking, the scores around these issues are not great. And that's even though we've at the moment set a fairly low bar. Three core areas: bottle weight, exploration of the use of alternative formats, and a basic requirement around logistics choices. Yeah, some positives. It's great that the bottle weight accord gets referenced in quite a lot of standards. And that's great because that shows that our work is having considerable value. It's informing the process. Several more standards have said yes, they will move towards adopting that as they come to their next evaluations. We're also seeing quite a lot of information around packaging within the standards. It's some quite interesting discussions around different packaging types and all those sorts of things. But it's a question of moving from discussion of the topic through to making more specific recommendations within a standard. But obviously, part of the challenge with that is that it's quite difficult to make packaging recommendations because at the moment the information isn't there to be able to properly stack up the pros and cons of each. Hence, again, our work in this space at the moment and in the coming year. Um, so yes, you've got some clear, you know, recognition this is an issue, but more needs to be done over time. And we see our work. Obviously, at the moment, we're working on sparkling wine bottle weight. We'll be revisiting the still wine bottle weight next year. We're also developing our tool around packaging choices. So again, we hope that that will mean that there is clear guidance that we can put into the GRF from which standards can then learn. And again, it's all about this sort of shared evidence base that people can move forward collectively. I mean, the challenge sometimes with sustainability is there are slightly different understandings of these things, which mean that there's a dissonance in action, and that's what we hope to address in what we do. Now, the other thing that was very different about this round of standards is that everything we reviewed so far were geographically specific standards. So that might have been in Italy, it might have been in California, it might have been in New Zealand, it might have been in Australia, it might have been in South Africa. But two of the standards we reviewed within the current batch were both global standards. So that's EU Organic and the Demeter Biodynamic Standard. Now, there are obvious advantages to these standards. The most obvious of which is that they have that global recognition. It's rare that you see some of the geographically specific wine sustainability standards mentioned in wine lists, but you quite often, even in local pubs, you'll get biodynamic or organic listed against a wine. So, for better or ill, these are approaches which do have had connect through to the consumer. And because, of course, these things can also be applied to other things, not just wine. You can have an entire meal built up of products that are certified to these standards. So it does offer that global consistency. I mean, if we hark back to what I was saying at the beginning of the conversation around the need for this clarity globally between standards, arguably standards which are globally applicable and applicable across different value chains is hugely important. There is a however. I won't say a but. There is a however. Um, the most obvious one is there's a lack of detailed how-to guidance. Yes, there's a certification benchmark at the end of the process, but the detail around so what does an individual wine manager need to do on a Monday morning is less clear. So that lack of detailed practical how-to guidance is a challenge. There can also be inconsistencies, and this is particularly true with the EU standard, in practice. So EU Organic focuses on chemical use, but also talks about the importance of soil health. But we know in wet seasons, and this particularly in southern France and northern Italy last year, um, there's a need for more applications, which obviously has issues around soil compaction, use of tractor. There's also issues that aren't covered within the EU standard, particularly kind of labour issues, and the sort of secondary issues around environment. So I think the point I suppose we'd say is that these standards have huge value because they have that sort of global application. The challenge is they are not equal to sustainability. That there are other things that need to come in that are not always in these standards. Interestingly, though, Demeter does cover more ground than EU Organic. Um, I guess another point one could make is that because both of these standards can be quite tough to certify to, it is quite likely that wines certified to those standards are grown by people who are paying attention to other things. But these labels on their own do not mean the same thing as sustainable. And really, this comes back to one of the key messages that we've had all the way through this. That, I mean, Toby and I always banging about this, but it was only relatively late in the day that things like fair trade and Rainforest Alliance became badges, that would stick on packaging. The original intent was that they were a management toolkit, a to-do list of, okay, so what does sustainability involve and how do you go about doing it? And particularly when you've got small wineries where their time and personnel poor, having a clear sense of this is what we need to do in what order on all of the different fronts is absolute gold dust. I mean, I was lucky enough to speak at the Australian Wine Institute Technical Conference in Adelaide last week and talk to quite a lot of smaller scale growers. For them, this sense of, I've got to fit this around everything else I need to do, having a really clear handbook of this is what I need to do is incredibly important. And arguably on a day-to-day basis more important than the actual, label at the end of the day. So I think standards and their ability to be able to provide that doability, to use the word that Delaney used earlier, is really, really important. And certainly is something that standards really need to focus also in the way they're written. Some are really exemplary in terms of readability, others are less so. Um, an example is one that we covered this time around, who have huge detail on apps, pretty much everything there is to know about grape growing and winemaking, but they define practice all the way in four different layers from pre-initial through to developed. So it's really clear for any winery what they need to do, whether that's on water, whether that's on energy, whether that's on labor, whether that's on any topic. There's a really clear trajectory, which is really, really helpful. So there are, I suppose, therefore, some sort of slightly more macro level points that sort of have occurred to us in this process. I mean, the first is this point about gradualism. You can't do it all at once. And again, reverting back to what I was saying about labour standards, that if a standards body steps too far away from where its membership and its potential certifying companies are, then you don't bring things forward. You've got to be able to demonstrate to people this is why this issue is important. How can we move forward together? Because if you end up with a standards body moving ahead of the pack and losing a large number of people involved, then actually what's the point? Sustainability needs people to be included in it. So this process of how do we make sure that improvement's developing over time. And again, this is why we feel that this benchmarking process, which will be done annually, is important because it allows us to spot that development, that trajectory over time. A second issue, and again, this came out very strongly from the conversations I was having in Australia last week, that there's a risk that sustainability professionals like I will tend to say it needs to trump sustainability needs to trump anything else, and that's absolutely not the case. Sustainability has to be seated alongside all the other priorities a business might need to have. At the moment, it's a tough business environment, so people see the rationale and they see the importance of sustainability, but it's got to sit within that wider business context. It's got to sit within a wider business strategy. And again, part of what I hope we're able to do is to make that link. I've already mentioned the importance of the narrative. It's not just about the individual scoring in an individual year. It's about the what a standards body and the people working with it think they're trying to do and how they're going to get to that eventual goal. Um, and certainly, I think what we're finding is that we've seen some real innovations, some really, really interesting innovations in way things are going. And one of the things we want to do later in the year when we've completed the benchmarking is to do a sort of greatest hits of the sort of the best ways forward we think we've seen. But also, it's really demonstrated that at the heart of what SWR is meant to be there is about the importance of sharing knowledge. We keep on saying this, but it's true. The wine sector is very fragmented, and that means that good practice and knowledge is not always shared as wide as it might be. And it's been the standards bodies we're working with have been in many cases kind enough to say that us coming along and saying this is what we're seeing at an international level is useful to them. Equally, it's incredibly useful to us to be able to say, wow, look at what's going on here. We need to share that because others can then use it. And we need to eventually, over time, drive that to every grape grower and winemaker. Back to you, Lenny.
All right. So then what's next? We'll be publishing the members only sort of complete version of the report from this round in the coming weeks, which will include that full evaluation and the narrative comment and the scores that Peter was talking through earlier from this past round, plus the sort of takeaways that we've talked through already a little bit. But the public webinar will also be released actually next week, covering off what we've talked about here. So talking about the overarching themes, talking about the process as a whole. So if you are an SWR member, please keep an eye out for that members only report. And if you're not, keep an eye out on your inbox because the public report will be dropping next week very shortly. And then between now and the end of the year, we'll be continuing with the remaining evaluations. So we're now through, I believe, 15, which puts us around a third of the way through. So Peter and I will be chugging along with the rest of the evaluations. And we plan to complete this, the full round of standards by December this year. and that will form a part of an annual cycle. So following when we complete all those evaluations, we'll be doing a quick update to the GRF. We'll be making sure that all the insights and learnings from this first complete round are reflected into the GRF, and as well as updating it with all the new information that we know on things like packaging, things like labor standards, things like logistics, things Peter was touching on earlier. And then that will pick up the annual cycle of revisiting all the standards that we've touched on so far, updating our benchmarking, our scores, our comments to keep it all relevant and actionable and reflect the changes that have been made in the interim. But just as important as the scoring itself is the actual ongoing dialogue with the standards bodies, with producers, with our members and retailers alike. So we think that's really important in terms of improving the usefulness and impact of certification. So we'll continue keeping that up as well. And really finally, just a quick call to action or message. Members get full access to the report, as I've already said. So if you're not yet a member and you're interested in seeing the detailed insight that we've talked through already, and the scores along with the evaluations, please do get in touch. We'd love to have you join the membership. There's a lot of a real value in seeing the actual sort of detail of those evaluations, especially if you are certified to one of the standards we've covered so far, or interested in having one of your standards that you're certified to, or your standards body be covered as well. So please do reach out to us. And for SWR members, if you have any questions or need any clarifications on the work we've done so far, please also don't hesitate to reach out. Peter and I are happy to answer any questions on this front. So on the theme of questions, we now would like to open it up to Q&A. So you'll see there's a small Q&A box on the bottom. Feel free to drop any questions you have there, but you're also welcome to raise your hand. I believe we can give you speaking permissions if you want to speak up and have the courage to do that. Otherwise, type your questions in the Q&A box below. And in the meantime, Peter and I will sit here awkwardly awaiting your very interesting questions.
And the Esther lady would like you to know that she's that thing that looks like she's at a rather lovely apartment in the south of France is because she is at a rather lovely villa in the south of France. And don't be shy, everyone.
Also, just to note that this session is recorded, so if you have anything you'd like to revisit, we'll be posting it on our YouTube channel after. All right, Tanya, I see you're raising your hand. I'm just going to try and give you speaking permissions. Let's see. How do I do this? Sorry for the awkward. Okay, there we go.
Oh, well done.
Wow, terrific. Yeah, well done. Thanks so much for this. It's always great to hear updates on the great work that SWR is doing. I was really struck by the reactions that some have had to the idea of including labor standards, and including labor. And really, it was that idea that it's somehow questioning their integrity. And I'm curious if you've ever had any response like that in terms of quote unquote questioning how they manage a vineyard, since that really is so integral to a functioning vineyard, is just sustainably managing it. So I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit more about that reaction.
When you say managing the vineyard, you mean as in the viticultural side of things?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, but I think what it comes down to in this sense, wine's not, it's not unusual. I mean, I've seen this in all the areas of sustainability I've worked in, is that if you're dealing with environmental issues, there's usually a fairly straightforward technical fix. You're emitting too much carbon. What can we do, for example, about, buying more fuel efficient tractors, or we can invest in, a wind turbine or something. So it's kind of like there's a technical fix, and it's impersonal. I think the challenge with labor issues is you are by definition dealing with how other human beings are treated, and that makes it a more sensitive issue. And and I think also because the wine sector has not had this agenda pushed to it in quite the same way as perhaps apparel or coffee or cocoa or tea have, that there's a real sense of not quite scared, but they actually really don't know. I mean, I was talking to someone a week or two back, and about this whole question of what we're seeing around checking labor providers. And this individual said he'd gone back to his farm and said to his colleagues, so do we actually check these things? And the answer was no, we don't. And I was in a workshop in London hosted by the Wine Society about 6 weeks ago. And there was a guy in the UK who provided labor into the UK industry. And he was saying he's got all the right tickets and all the right certifications he needs to have. But he said, be surprised how little I get asked for those. So I think it's because there's not necessarily an easy fix, as it were, a technical fix, but there's also these issues are systemic. It's not an individual winery. It's. I mean, look for example at what we're seeing in northern Italy. It's a process of the way in which labour has been provided to the industry as a whole in Piedmont, rather than to one individual winery. So it needs a collective piece. And I think then just really this point that they're really sensitive issues, really delicate issues, and many people in wine are not used to having to answer them. I think one of the things we're really noticing though is there's a realization that needs to change. That actually, yes, we do need to push forward, but it's and that's what I mean about this gradualism piece. We need to bring people along.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Tanya. Well, so we have another question from Nicola Desprez from Terravitas. So thank you for the update on the benchmarking process. Will you give the standards ideas about improvement paths that you might have gathered from other standards, or could we plan meetings between standards that are more or less similar to discuss good ideas, find new ways to improve?
I think yes, definitely. I mean, sorry, that sounds horribly presumptuous. What we seem to be finding is that because we're drawing on what other standards are doing, we can make suggestions, recommendations, provide thoughts. It's obviously we can't dictate practice. We can't say to a standards organization, you must do X or Y. What we can do is to say, here are what seem to be some interesting ways in which others are going around managing whatever the issue is. You might want to have a look. I mean, an example is to come back to Tanya's point about labour issues. We're linking together two standards bodies, one of whom is, realizing they need to address these issues and is looking for a way forward, with another standards organization in a similar type of location, which is already doing it. So it's how can we share that knowledge? So it's not so much ideas about improvement, because that sort of suggests that we're the experts and we're not. But what we can do is to say, here's what seems to be some interesting things you might want to take on board.
And similarly, Nicola, I know we've had conversations about this before. We really want to be able to encourage collaboration within the membership, particularly. So getting standards bodies together to discuss these themes is absolutely something that we're interested in doing. And actually, thank you for the reminder. It is something that we like to pick up on, especially following the results of this round of benchmarking. So for the standards bodies in the membership, Terravitas as well as the others, I mean, we'd absolutely love to set that up. So if that's something you're interested in, we will get to arranging it. So thank you, Nicola.
I think also one of the things that when we've got time to do it, is it would be to have a kind of working group, an ongoing working group of standards bodies, just so that they can work together, because effectively they're all aimed in the same direction. But there's, I think, often stuff that they can learn one from another, and some of that happens anyway. I mean, but to the extent to which we can help facilitate more of that, all well and good.
All right. We also have another question from Siglinda Losh. So, looking at the strength of standards are great. Have we considered including costs of certification? How sustainable the cost of is to keep doing it year on year? So, thanks, Siglinda. I mean, this is something that we absolutely see as relevant. And when we were building our scoring matrix, it was really important for us to include a point in on collaboration and inclusivity. So within that point, something that we do look at is the cost of certification and inclusion of small producers. So coming back to that, the point we touched on earlier about including small producers, cost is absolutely something that we look at and something that we're scoring. Now, in terms of how sustainable it is to keep up year on year, that's also something that we look at. But it is a little bit of there is a cost benefit analysis, because a lot of the standards do provide a lot of additional support, whether that be with, actual from their staff that are coming and helping you, or extra materials or reports, those sorts of things. It's, there is clear that there's a lot of added value to this as well. So Peter, passing along to you, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think you know, particularly I know I mean you're hitting on a really important point. I mean, especially in the context of somewhere like South Africa. Although actually, the industry globally, you know, you've got a lot of small producers, and I think there's and in addition to what Delaney said, there's a couple of other points. Is that you know a couple of standards bodies have said that some organizations they're saying we don't need to be certified because actually you know what we sell mostly locally, so the fact of market access doesn't really matter. So there is that fact. But I think it's also then seeing not just looking at it as a cost, what else does it bring to the business? I mean, as Delaney said, a lot of the standards bodies do provide, you know, what amounts to some really quite intensive, almost like consultancy support. And I also think that there is this point about market access that whether we like it or not, increasingly being seen to be certified to a credible standard is going to be necessary to get access into certainly a lot of European markets, Australasia, lots of the US. So there are those other things. Also, although there are costs involved in certification, there may also be cost savings as well. If you look at something like, um, you know, most of the standards will look at, you know, how do you generally reduce the use of chemicals over time, and being able to do that in a way which is targeted, as in you still have um, enough performance in order to have chemistry doing what it needs to do in the vineyard, but actually perhaps using less of it and therefore having some cost savings in that regard. You know, ditto around packaging. I mean, I was talking to one of the producers I was speaking to in Australia last week, and they had recently gone to bulk shipping for their wines into Europe, and they reckoned they were saving between 25 and 30% on their transport costs. So there is a balance between the cost and the benefit. But yes, it's always going to be important that how we include small growers, which is, you know, why this greatest hits is going to be almost most important when it comes to small growers. Because if you can't find ways of making sure they get involved, then you run the risk that sustainability just becomes a rich man's game, which is absolutely not what we want to be.
All right. Well, we also have another question in from Mark O'Brien. Is SEDEX included as a certification slash measure? I presume you mean within our benchmarking
Mm,
process.
yeah.
As of the standards we've covered so far, no, we haven't yet done SEDEX. In terms of, it's also not on our list of sort of wine specific, sort of sustainability certifications, just because it, well, actually, Peter, I'll let you touch on that.
No, I mean, Sedix, I mean, you'd be surprised actually how, because obviously Sedix is a good resource. So I think I'd see it more as a measure than a certification. Um, but you'd be surprised how few even mention it. I mean, again, it's perhaps reflects the relatively low level of awareness within the wine sector by comparison with other sectors around this, that SEDEX is not more widely used. I mean, certainly we see it often with what retailers, particularly big retail, like the Nordic monopolies, Aldi, Harry's, Tesco, and so on, because obviously it is part of their understanding of how you manage labour rights. But it's not something we've seen much of within the standards bodies so far. But it's certainly a useful tool. In and of itself, I don't think it is sufficient in relation to what we're looking for at an operational level, because you need that granularity of, right, the problem is around hiring, largely rather, the problem is around hiring during the growing season and actually understanding how those labor providers operate at your local level is really where the issues are. And again, if you look at of all the standards we've covered, the one that covers social best is WITA in South Africa. Um, and you know, one of the things they do is require a certification and audit to be done, you know, in conjunction with a local NGO who can really understand that piece. So SEDEX is a really useful tool. I don't think will be sufficient for us. It's not being much used so far, but we'd like that to change.
Oh, fantastic. We have another question from Susan Bale. Thank you very much, Susan. We really appreciate it. So the question is, looking forward to becoming more involved. Your remit extends for wine tourism. Is wine tourism on the radar, or still too much to be done in other areas first? I.e., communicative and experimental extension of sustainability in vineyards and cellars.
Well, I've been co-opted onto the wine tourism group, expert group within OIV. So we are at least learning a bit more about it. And yes, it's on our radar, but at the moment we've got, and you're looking at the research team at the moment, and a bit of Ilva. So it's definitely on the radar. And if there's elements of good practice that you can bring to our attention, fabulous. But it's not something that we're going to be working on in the short term. Say our focus at the moment is on completing this first round of benchmarking on on the kind of wider packaging issues, and then also on logistics, because again, that's another really underexplored but massive issue. But no, try and keep us honest on that one, Susan.
All right. We also, Tanya has a follow-up question or comment from earlier. Is there a discussion to be had re what regulatory systems need to be in place and what changes need to be made to an existing one, perhaps bringing producers together before holding them to a standard? And this was brought up in reference to Champagne, making this quite clear.
When you say regulatory system, we're not really in a position to influence. I mean, in this case, it will be French law. That way, I think, would lie madness. We don't have the capacity to be a lobbying organization. Because also, in the reality of the situation is that the regulatory system, sorry, the regulations in France were perfectly adequate. Just the process of regulation, actually, how that operated on a day-to-day basis, wasn't robust enough. I think, it's not our role, I don't think, to to be a lobbying organization. I mean, I think there are elements we can do, but to try and do that in many different jurisdictions would be very difficult. But I think the extent to which we can make sure that standards bodies, and I think we're beginning to get there, standards bodies recognize that these are issues that need to be proactively addressed within the process of certification to a standard. And the kind of the level we're setting is that there is proactivity around. It's not just that a standard mentions, working hours, or mentions pay rates, or mentions child labor, or mentions traffic labor. There needs to be a proactive attempt to understand if there are challenges in place. And certainly bringing producers together is something that we're looking at doing under our labour rights piece, and certainly we've already done a certain amount of that in Italy, and we're participating in various for the challenge is simply the amount of time available. That to get things to work on the ground, it is about understanding the granularity of some of these things within particular geographies, and to some extent, therefore, what we can perhaps better do is highlight what's already going on. I mean, what's going on, say, in Northern Italy with the Stronger Together, which is doing training around the place, an organization called WICO, and the Accademia della Vigna, which is trying to understand the detail of how these issues manifest in well, particularly the Langer region. So yes, it's important, but it's at the moment, I think the way in which we can have the greatest impact is by continuing to push that standards need to cover this and do it proactively. Because if we can, and it looks like that it's moving in that direction. I mean, some of the conversations we had with the first round of benchmarking, we got quite a lot of pushback on it. It's clear that actually there's a recognition that more needs to be done within the nature of the standard. So I'm quite hopeful that by the time we renew this process next year, there'll be a lot more robust practice within standards, which obviously then the standards sort of provide that kind of glue to provide a vehicle for collective action.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that runs us through all the questions in the Q&A box. If anyone has anything else they'd want to bring up, again, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, thank you everyone for who did submit a question. It's really helpful. And thanks, Tanya, for being willing to turn your mic on and being brave. It's always great to have another voice pop in. So thank you.
Yeah.
But with that, then we will kind of close out the session. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to Peter or I. If you look at the recording, our emails will be there. And so we're happy to answer any more questions you've got. Cool. And in the meantime, keep an eye out for the report, which will be dropping relatively soon.
Brilliant. Thanks everyone for coming on.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.